Good morning, friends. A Day story here. Glad to have you back with me as I share with you once again. I want to thank you all for liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. It gets my content out as well as shows YouTube that you're supporting me. So I appreciate you all for doing that for me. I really appreciate it because this work is valuable to me as a part of my own personal journey. And sharing my stories as life lessons has become something that is necessary for me to do at this point through this venue. So I appreciate you all for joining me. I also want to say, if you find this content valuable in a small way, in a huge way, I ask that you share it with a friend, someone that you care about, that you want to also see them grow and succeed and be well. Don't forget to like, subscribe, click that notification bell so that you know when my next video is uploaded. So let's get into it today. Today, friends, I want to talk about vulnerability in the process of transformation. And as you remember, I have my notes here. So if I look down, know that I'm reading through the notes. I want to be concise, value your time, but also want to make sure that I hit the points that I know I need to talk about this morning. Vulnerability in the process of transformation has been, like I shared before, something that before I share with you life lessons and these stories as life lessons, I have to be first partaker of these lessons. So let me share a little bit with you about how vulnerability has shown up in my life and in my journey. First of all, I'm all about naming something, defining something as well, and if necessary, defending it. So let's define what vulnerability is. By definition, vulnerability is a state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, especially physically or emotionally. So let's unpack what that means, right? Because that's such a clinical or a sterile way of defining what vulnerability is. At the heart of what I believe vulnerability is the act of stepping out of your comfort zone. We've heard that before, but also stepping into the unknown. So for me, vulnerability is stepping out of your comfort zone, but also stepping in to the unknown. That thing that we necessarily don't know what's around the bend, or we don't have a map or directions or those things that keep us as we feel safe. To share a personal story, these past couple of days, past couple of weeks, maybe week or two, I've really had to step into vulnerability. And for me, vulnerability looks like, feels like, behaves like uncomfortable, unnerving anxiety, sometimes depression. And it moves me in what I feel is like a bubble or a brain fog. Most times I'm really concise. I know what I'm doing. I wake up in the morning. I know what my day is going to be. I've planned out my week, maybe 2 weeks ahead. But when I'm in a state of vulnerability, I'm moving into a place in my own journey where it's not as smooth. The road is not as smooth. It's not this nice asphalt pavement. I'm a city girl, so there's no sidewalk. It feels like I'm walking through a field of tall grass. And vulnerability is like not being able to see, not being able to know with certainty. And I stress that with certainty, that my next move, the next thing that I say, the next interaction that I have, my next move that is required of me for my growth, it's going to be okay. And vulnerability sits in us in that way sometimes. Brene Brown, Dr. Brene Brown, and I'm sure some of you know who she is. She is a researcher in Texas, and very famous woman right now. Love her work, use her work in my research as well. But she talks about her research primarily being around vulnerability and shame. She's a vulnerability and shame researcher. So I suggest that you look at some of her work. She has several books on vulnerability and shame and guilt. So for further learning and information, because that is not my area, I am not a shame researcher. I am not a vulnerability researcher. I am sharing what vulnerability means to me as a personal journey, as a life lesson, as I've moved and experienced vulnerability for myself. But Dr. Brene Brown is an expert on vulnerability and shame. And what she talks about mostly is how, and I'm going to read a quote or paraphrase quote that she's mentioned many times. And she says that there is no growth, change, or innovation if there's no vulnerability. And you know, we know what growth is. We know what change is. We know what innovation is. But when we look at the very nexus of what those things are, the nucleus of what those things are, at the heart of those things is vulnerability. There's never been a great work of art that an artist has created without vulnerability. There's never been a book written without a level of anxiety, vulnerability. There's never been an act of courage that did not couple itself or partner itself with vulnerability. There hasn't been innovation in technology or in medicine and science without vulnerability. Because what vulnerability does, like we said, it exposes us in our innermost parts. It shares with the world this thing that is so precious to us, yet we want to keep it at bay. We want to keep people away from it. So vulnerability requires that we open ourselves up, that we crack ourselves open, that we expose ourselves. But there is, on the other side of that vulnerability, this reward. And I call it a reward because it is something that is a gift to us. It may not look like a gift when it's received, but it is definitely a blessing. It is a gift. And I'll talk about what those gifts look like a little bit later in this video. But with vulnerability, creativity sits inside of that. It revolutionizes our thinking to this new level. We understand more deeply when we're vulnerable. We push ourselves through that risk when we're vulnerable. But I want to make sure that we understand that there's this trend that is happening right now around what vulnerability could look like, sound like, behave like, right? And in this, I'm also a media and culture critic consultant as well in other work that I do and training that I do. And specifically in media, where I want to talk about, like, this is media here on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of those things that we love, we use, we can't do without. Also, what we like to call reality TV, and all of those ways that we get to get a glimpse into other people's lives and journeys, right? There is this level of perceived vulnerability in some of the interactions and the behaviors and the things that these people are actually experiencing. And I do not want to suggest that there is no vulnerability in those platforms, because I'm sure that there is a level of vulnerability and risk and courage that those people, those individuals partake in when they share themselves with the world, because vulnerability is exposure, right? Like what I'm doing here, this is a level of vulnerability for me that is sharing or exposing parts of myself with you. So there's definitely a level of vulnerability in those social media or media platforms, or those shows and those things, those guilty pleasures that we like to engage in. But what I want to do is make a distinction. Vulnerability, transparency, and authenticity. I'm going to say that again. Vulnerability, transparency, and authenticity are not the same as keeping it real. Atunde, what do you mean by keeping it real? You hear people say that, I'm going to keep it real with you. Let's be real, right? There's a difference, friends. And what I found is the difference when we keep it real versus when we're vulnerable is that keeping it real has this level of fear that is violent. I'm going to say that again. Keeping it real has a level of fear attached to it that is violent. It is emotionally violent. It can sometimes be physically violent, psychologically, mentally violent, but also spiritually violent. And I'm going to make another video later on in this conversations that we have that talks about how we guard ourselves from certain things coming into our mental, emotional, spiritual spaces for our growth and transformation. But this keeping it real that has this displayed violence to it is not vulnerability. What vulnerability is this exposure to the person, to you, that is the risk that you take with yourself to be exposed to yourself or in a relational way. Because vulnerability shows up in two ways. Vulnerability is personal, or vulnerability with the self, or vulnerability is relational, transactional, right? Remember, we talked about relationships being transactional, and vulnerability shows up in those two ways. But authenticity and transparency is coupled with vulnerability for you, right? And let me give you an example of how this vulnerability, transparency, and authenticity can be different from keeping it real, right? So for me personally, when I'm vulnerable with myself and I want to move or transcend past a point of violence, because yes, we can be violent with ourselves, friends. There is a level of violence that happens when there is a moment when you have to be vulnerable with yourself, that you can be violent to you. I've experienced that over the last couple of days, where I had to shift what my vulnerability and remember what vulnerability actually was, so that I was not just keeping it real with myself, but being vulnerable and authentic and transparent with myself. So I was having a moment where I was praying, asking, and desiring something. And yet again, it seems as if in my life there's these moments where I get these huge gains in my life, right? And I'm grateful for those gains, but it's always this one thing that I ask for, that I pray for, right? That is eluding me, that's elusive, that I can't quite put my hands on. And when I get into the place where I'm like going in this circle, but yet I'm chasing the thing that I'm asking for, and I understand that there's a difference where you don't chase, you wait in some cases and what have you. And we'll talk about that in another video. But there's this cycle of asking and receiving that I'm like, okay, why am I not receiving what I asked for? Because I have faith to believe that I'll receive the very thing that I'm asked for, because I'm prepared to receive it, right? So for me, I'm sitting and I'm like, okay, I'm grateful for the things that I have received, that I've asked for, and some things that I haven't, that I'm even super excited when I get those things and I receive those blessings. But why is it this this right here? It's still out of arm's reach, you know? So for me, I go into this state of what I call going in, but it also is coupled with a little bit of depression. So, and sometimes deep depression. So I'm sitting in that, and we've already talked about feeling your feelings, allowing your feelings to come up, because there is a lesson in that. So I'm going through the process of feeling my feelings. And in that moment of feeling my feelings, I had the opportunity to either keep it real with me or be vulnerable. Because when we start to feel and unearth those things that are hidden to us, we get into a fight or flight mode, even with ourselves. We run away from our feelings. We run away from our past. We run away from, I don't want to deal with that, right? And I had experienced that. So for a moment, I was keeping it real, because I'm like, it's not me, it's this, it's that, and right? Because we justify, we cover up, we don't take accountability. And after a little bit of that, keeping it real and being you, rather than wait, let's take a look, let's take a deeper look, let's get deep into the soil, right? I had to say, wait a minute. Yes, you are in a position to receive what you asked for. But are you sure about the content? Let's dig into the content of what you asked for, because that's the seed that you planted. Whatever seed you plant is what's going to come up, right? So I had to go back and look at this tree that I had planted, because I'm like missing the forest for the trees, because I had prayed, asked for something, and it had come up. But in my level of growth, I had missed that I no longer desired the apple tree that had come up in my orchard, because I had grown into a deeper level of understanding of myself, that understood that, hey, I've had enough apples. Let's try another something, fruit, whatever you want to call it, right? But it had manifested. It wasn't that I wasn't receiving what I asked for, because I had not understood that I had transformed in this new space what I had asked for had come up, but I was in a new place, no longer desiring it. So I had to be authentic and say, hey, thank you for the blessings that I did receive, because I had received it. Because in the archives of my life, I had to go back, because remember saying Kofa, go back and get the lesson. I had actually received what I had prayed for. But then being authentic and vulnerable with myself, I had to say, hey, now you need a new seed. You need to pray a new prayer, because you understand differently. You can't pray the same prayer when you've gone through a level of transformation and you're no longer the same. Remember, growth, change, and innovation does not happen without vulnerability. So I had to be open with myself and authentic with myself and said, hey, you need to redefine this desire, because if you keep adding water to that tree, that's what's going to keep growing. But we don't really want apples anymore. So I had to mourn this, because now I understand that there is more growth on this side, because apple trees don't grow overnight. I had to be authentic with my feelings and say, wow, this may take another couple of years for me to actually receive this, because I need to grow this seed and water this seed and nurture this seed. But I'm grateful that I understand now that it was not the thing, but it was me. And that thing is okay. Those apple trees nourish and supply and give shade to those that desire it. I just don't desire apples or an apple tree. Now I got to go and plant somewhere else in my garden. Now I'm not going to uproot my apple tree, because like I said, it does what it is its intended purpose and function is, right? It's a good thing. It's just not the good thing that I desire now in this new level, in this new phase, right? So that's the difference between keeping it real, because keeping it real could be very elusive to yourself, versus being vulnerable and accountable for your own level of interrogation, because that it's not this interplay between you and this outside party per se in moments of personal vulnerability, right? Because there are two ways in which vulnerability enacts itself. But before your vulnerability becomes relational, you got to deal with you first. And I think that when we get into, like I was talking earlier about the media, some of what I perceive is a level of keeping it real without being vulnerable with oneself first and being accountable to oneself first. I can't check you if I haven't checked me. I gotta look at me first. There's this sister that I listen to. Her name is Toni Jones. Shout out to Toni Jones. She's phenomenal, friends. Phenomenal. A young African American young black woman who does music, and she's very lyrical, but her songs are prayers and mantras and affirmations. And she says in one of the songs that she does called Lens Check, gotta check it out, I gotta see me before I could see you. And that's what vulnerability does. I can't be open with you if I'm not open with me, or open to me, or exposed to me. I can't be authentic with you if I'm not authentic with myself. I can't be exposed without these levels of what I found in vulnerability. And this is the third point that I want to share. We talk about vulnerability, and Brene Brown talks about this as well. And like I said, I encourage you to do your own research with Dr. Brene Brown's work, because I'm sure that you will find her work helpful, as well as, you know, my work in this video, as well as her breadth and body of work as complementary. You know, I supplement her work because she's the master in talking about vulnerability. But 2 points of vulnerability, whether it is personal vulnerability or relational vulnerability, vulnerability requires courage. And courage is, for me, and I've lived for a very long time with this definition of courage, and it's from Teddy Roosevelt. And Dr. Brene Brown actually uses that quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and I've made it concise, and I also used Oscar Wilde's definition of courage as well. It's courage is not the absence of fear. It is realizing that there is something greater than the fear, and it is doing it with the fear until the fear subsides. I'm going to say that again. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is realizing that there is something greater than the fear and doing it anyway until the fear subsides. Now, you can take that definition and apply it to yourself as well as relationally where it comes to vulnerability. Because remember, vulnerability requires courage. There is no vulnerability, because vulnerability is this cracking open, this exposure. This is jumping into the deep, right? Stepping out, raising your hand. It requires courage. So there's something greater than the fear, right? Because the fear is there, right? I am deathly afraid of jumping in the ocean. I can swim, but I can't swim ocean swim. I think there's a different level of swimming skill in swimming in the ocean, like marathon swimmers or seal divers. I can't do, no. Now, 12 feet of water, 6 feet of a pool, I'm good. But there's a different level of courage it takes for a Navy SEAL to fall out of an airplane, hit water in the darkness, and find their way to the shore. That's courage, right? Doing it with the fear, knowing that there is something greater. For me, I knew that there was levels in my life, that there was something greater. Getting a PhD, there was definitely fear there. But on the other side of that was the work that I get to do now. There was something greater. That work was that greater for me. And doing it moment by moment until that fear started to, and there are still moments of fear, but it's not as great in my body. It's not as, in my face where I'm like, oh my God, I need a minute. Sometimes I'm like, okay, I feel it. I'm afraid, but it doesn't shake me to a point where I'm like, okay, give me a week, doing it with the fear until the fear subsides. Asking someone out on a date, exposure, vulnerability, courage, right? Asking a boss for a promotion. You've done your research, you know what your job description is, and you are in hand and ready. But it takes courage to knock on the door and say, excuse me, sir, excuse me, ma'am, may I have a moment with you? Can I get on your schedule? I'd like to discuss something with you. That takes courage. Moving, done that a couple of times. Courage to pack all of your belongings and go somewhere that you've never been before. Done that too, twice. That's more stories, friends. But it takes courage to do those things, right? But vulnerability requires also trust. courage in one hand, trust in the other. Vulnerability requires that you trust yourself, that you'll be able to pick yourself back up even if you fall apart. That the falling apart will not break you, that you can make it through it. And trust yourself enough that if I go knock on this door and ask my boss for this raise and get a no, that I'll be okay. Because there's something greater than the fear. I want my money. I deserve this. I've earned this. I work. I do the work anyway. Trusting yourself enough to say, I can do it. And even if I shoot for the moon, or hit a star, that's a whole nother saying. I think I'm messing that up. But if I'm reaching for the moon and I grab a star, I'm not mad. It's still heavenly, still celestial. Maybe I need a bigger rope to pull the moon out of the sky, but I can grab a star with my hands. Trust yourself. Don't let you tell you no. You let them tell you no, and then you ask again. Okay, friends? So, just to recap, vulnerability is a state of being exposed, friends. I come to you in our videos, in our time together in the cafe with my coffee, to be exposed, to be open and vulnerable with you, to share my stories so that you, as your own storyteller, can go back into your own lessons, right? But vulnerability does not happen in a vacuum, right? There's no growth, no change, or innovation. Dream up that business plan. Somebody needs it. Be vulnerable, be open. Get the food truck. You've been cooking with your granny all this time. You know all the recipes that she never wrote down. Somebody needs it. And if you do it with the fear until the fear subsides, remember, right? That courage, you're going to gain perspective, right? You're going to gain more understanding of you at a deeper level. It requires courage. Vulnerability requires courage. It requires trust. I'm not going to look like a fool. And even if I do, I look good at it, right? Trust yourself. Because if you don't trust you, nobody else will. Friends, that's all I have for you for this video. Remember, vulnerability in the process of transformation is necessary for you to move from level to level, cycle to cycle, season to season. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about what that can look like for your personal journey, right? Understanding your personal cycles of transformation. And I'm going to share with you what my cycles of transformation have looked like for me. So, friends, I really appreciate you once again for joining me today. Like I said, like, share, comment, subscribe, ring that notification bell so that you know, I tuned in and put another video out there. Go on, girl. Supporting young, new, up-and-coming content creators like myself. I surely appreciate you. And I'm going to link in this video description Dr. Brene Brown's information, as well as Toni Jones. Get with her. That sister's amazing. But I'm going to put that information at the in the link in this video. I've enjoyed my time with you. Hope to see you again soon. And you have a wonderful day. This is a Tune Day. And this has been my story.